Oh, he just uploaded another one. Oh, I have no idea what this video is about. I did watch this one. There's a really long one over here. There was one we were watching together, wasn't it? Nature of Astrology. I wasn't I? And we had to stop because I had to stop streaming. All right, we'll continue that one.
Fix a car.
Because
that's as I was.
He has, going back to Mesopotamian times, a long empirical tradition that started with the collection of observing observations between celestial movements and earthly events, and then writing those down on clay tablets and passing that down from generation to generation as observations about these correlations that they were seeing. And that's when we say, like, the practice is part of what we mean by the practice, or what you mean by the practice is that sort of collective or cumulative empirical tradition to a certain extent of astrology.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. And, it's been pretty consistent. I mean, this is, a great argument. I bring this up to people. I say, Saturn's been pretty much the same thing for the last 3,000 years, if not longer. I mean, it's cold and hard. It's associated with the temperaments and so on. But astrology has just become more sophisticated in terms of its understanding of the primary symbols, and that's an empirical project. That's a result of centuries of observations. And of course, everything takes place in the context of the culture that you're in, but they have accumulated, and we're the beneficiaries of it.
Right. And I think one of the points you make at one point is that you can collect, not just in astrology, but in other scientific fields, like collect a series of observations about a correlation and the outcome of something that you're seeing, of something that's happening in nature, without necessarily knowing the mechanism of why that's happening or how that's happening.
Yeah.
That eventually you want to get to that point ideally, but it's not necessary in all instances for the practice to persist by just observing the sort of outcome of that process, or just collecting the correlations themselves.
Yeah, I think that, that science can't be limited to reductionism. That, the naturalist does exactly what you described. He's looking at what's going on and trying to, make sense of it. If it gives rise to a theory, all the better, but it doesn't have to. You're still observing the behavior. Suppose you're studying, squirrels in your backyard, like I do. You watch them carefully, and you learn to, distinguish between the individuals and, follow their behavior and so on. That's doing science. That's a kind of science. I mean, really, biology was doing that for a long time, right? And the biologists were so excited when they finally got a good theory of evolution, and they got even more excited when they got some kind of molecular model.
Right. Well, I mean, and didn't evolution eventually develop? Darwin developed the theory of evolution eventually after a long series of observations and of field studies of going out into the field and studying things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big, characters in biology is Carl Linnaeus. Started classifying organisms, genus and species. So classification precedes all this other science. So it's a science. I'm very clear in this book that I think when people say follow the science, I say to myself, what the hell are they talking about? They should be saying, follow the reductionist, materialistic, mechanistic, deterministic science. That's what they're saying. They don't even know what they're saying. They just call it the science, but science is bigger than that. There's just a lot of people that are, they want to make everything physics. Science is a collaborative, democratic method, a collection of methods to make knowledge about the natural world. That's, I think, a good definition. You just can't make something up and say it's true. I mean, you could do that in religion, but you can't do that in science. If you say, the sky is blue, you have to get some confirmation from other people. That makes it democratic. Science is a sophisticated body of knowledge that is greater than simple know-how, which is more like trial and error. And you have know-how, you can fix a car, but you don't know how the car works. Science, takes that further and analyzes every step and tries to understand how the car works.
Yeah, well, and that you meant drive a car, I think.
Fix a car.
Because that's
as I was speaking, I was imagining myself under one of my old Chevys or Volkswagens taking it apart.
okay. Well, I was thinking of an analogy that I use sometimes, that astrologers are like practitioners or people that know how to operate a technology or an advanced technology. Like, I know how to use a microwave, for example, to like heat up a burrito without necessarily knowing fully the mechanics of like how a microwave works,
Yeah.
or being able to construct one. If I had to build one from scratch, it's possible to know how to use or operate a technology without necessarily knowing fully what the theoretical like principles are underlying it.
Sure, we could apply that to the study of electricity. It's a lot, people don't, exactly what electricity is, movement of electrons and so on. Um, it's an ongoing process, but they figured out what to do with it pretty quickly. You got electric light bulbs and motors and things like that, but they didn't really know what they were dealing with. They were dealing with a force of some sort.
Or even like gravity, for example. Like, people used gravity to their advantage in different ways prior to Newton coming along and explaining a theory, or coming up with a theory for what gravity is.
Yeah, you make a water wheel, it runs on gravity, or a clock, pendulum of some sort. Yeah, yeah, of course. So I have a very broad definition of science, and I don't think science should be limited to, taking part of nature into your laboratory and dissecting it into pieces, and then coming up with a mathematical equation to explain it and say this is the only definition of reality. I mean, even to get to that place, you have to do a lot of other things. As long as it's done in a way that's democratic, you have, you try to get a good consensus, and it's done logically and you follow a method, that's science. And I think astrology, is like a lot of these other subjects, like electricity that I mentioned, where we're dealing with we're dealing with something that's not easily explained in the context of current knowledge. There are ideas about it, which I talk about all through the book, but you still know how to work with it. You still know what to do with it, and there's a lot of evolution of technique. So I think that's one of the good things that's going on in astrology now, is you have a lot of experimentation with techniques from the ancient world and modern world and other parts of the world, India and so on. And people are testing these things out. Presumably, the testing will get more rigorous over time. I think right now the field of astrology is in kind of a both an exploratory phase, and it's also in a phase where it's trying to gather itself together to be a little bit more coherent and create some institutions.
All right, we're back from a break. So we've kind of covered what you cover in the middle of the book, which is the decline of astrology. And now we've started getting into part 3 of the book, where you focus on the history of the revival of astrology in modern times, some of the conflicts that have happened, especially with the skeptical and the scientific communities, as astrology has tried to reestablish itself as a respectable intellectual discipline. And then eventually you get into some reflections, some personal life reflections about your experience as an astrologer over the course of your life, as well as some statements about the future and how you think astrology is going to go over the course of the next century.
Yep.
So I was surprised by, like I said, as somebody that didn't come into the astrological field until I started studying astrology in 1999, and I was studying at Kepler in the mid 2000s, actually, partially with you. You're one of my teachers at Kepler College. I studied, but I wasn't around for some of the things that happened with the attempts to study astrology scientifically in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And it was interesting hearing in some instances about your firsthand experience with some of these tests, where you were actually like one of the astrologers that participated in some of the studies that were done during that time period.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Sean Carlson, that study. That was a terrible study. And yet it's because it was published in Nature, it's taken very seriously. You know, these guys, they test one thing. In this case, they tested astrologers' ability to connect charts with personality profiles that were created by the California Personality Inventory. And I point out, I mean, that's like comparing apples to oranges. It's not really fair. And people tell me that he did the statistics wrong. I never checked them out. I don't even know if I know enough to be able to find those differences, but other people that seem to know have said that, yeah, that was flawed as well. But in any case, it got out there as kind of a nail in the coffin thing. It really showed that astrologers don't know what they're talking about.
Right. One of the ones that was more interesting was the earlier study, the Vernon Clark studies, which was astrologers matching charts to clients, which was initially positive for astrology. But one of the observations that you made, I think, in terms of the issues with astrologers replicating studies like that is the lack of standardization in the field and the skill of practitioners kind of being all over the place because of the lack of standardization and the distinctions between like who's a skilled astrologer versus who's not being somewhat ambiguous sometimes.
To say the least, you know, hey, anybody can be an astrologer today. It's a free-for-all, you know, and I point out in several places that, you know, if you're a good hustler, you can get somewhere. I have Mars and Libra conjunct Neptune, so I've never really had the hustling instinct. You know, I had other things going on in my mind, but I just stuck with it. I have persistence, and so I did manage to make a living at it for a long time. But, you know, it's a chaotic situation when you have people in a field and there's no way to know who knows what. If you're an outsider, you come to astrology, well, who should I have? So they usually go by word of mouth, and that can work pretty well. But today with, you know, the ease of advertising, you know, back in, you know, before pre-internet, advertising was hard to do. You know, you had to print up newsletters. I used to have a newsletter I would send out by mail and, you know, that sort of thing. You had to do that. But today it's very easy. And so it's even more a case of, you know, somebody having good, you know, PR skills and a little bit of knowledge of astrology could develop a bigger clientele than somebody who's very competent but is not comfortable blowing their own horn. So that's, I think, a big problem in astrology today is that there's no way for the outside world to make sense of what the heck is going on.
Right. And I think you said in one of the studies, they just kind of like collected astrologers from one local astrology group or something like that.
Sorry, I turned off the mic. I think it was capturing both, and it was making it sound weird, I think. So I didn't check because Quinn has my phone, but I had to, like, turn off just real. But when he mentioned something about the fact the skills astrologer and how there's some ambiguity and there's no, like, firm case of it, then that means then when they study astrology, they should have studied it or taken it to the Vedic astrologer. But then I realized Vedic astrology is mostly in the Eastern world, and unless the Eastern world did their own, you know, study, which maybe they have, I don't know, we couldn't really prove anything with that, you know? So that's a good point of why the astrology has yet to be proven. I always kind of felt that way too, because one of the things about science that is extremely crucial with all forms of trying to prove theories and stuff, the difference between theories and just ideas really is mostly because there has to be consistently tested and making the same results each time and being checked by other professionals. And that's why, you know, certain theories can be mostly the truth. Of course, they can only say mostly the truth, mostly because if something comes around in the future to disprove that theory, which is very possible, then they can't necessarily say that is the absolute truth. So it's a kind of it's like a word game almost. Also, just more of the context that we're looking at when we're comparing astrology versus like to science, and why the science community is like, you need to prove and bring validity or some sense of standard of what it is, just like Vedic astrology has. And so what our problem is here is the fact that we are born in a society that is very much against anything that's outside of the capitalistic system, that's outside of any like rhetoric with the colonist Western Anglo-Saxon Christian ideals. And it's so funny to me that they would be so big on that, but then still believe in God, even though it's very easy to disprove God pretty easily. Like, just because certain things happen, could be a proof of anything. And that's why they only want to believe in something of an idea of morality. And this kind of goes back based on some of the stuff I've been watching about racism and all that. It's like, I think this is more of like just people from the past who had control and power saying only our way's right and everyone else is full of shit. And thus started all these weird things, and why religion will never actually bring peace to anyone. Religion wasn't used to promise peace. Religion was used to justify why things were, because there's no explanation why some people might have easier lives than others. But actually there is much more, as we become more consciously aware, it's becoming more obvious why certain people are doing worse than others, because there's a system in place to only keep certain people happy or certain people in power in expense of everyone else around us. And that is why people are miserable. Like, it's like, everyone's like blaming everything else, which yes, they contribute to it as well, but it's not the only thing. The whole very foundations of capitalism was guaranteed to make us all miserable in hindsight. So, but nobody wants to admit that, because then we'll be going against the very system that we've all sort of like indoctrinated ourselves in as a society. And so I can understand why this will be a very long, painful battle for capitalism. And I don't know how long it will last, or if we're going to have to do what our ancient ones have to do. I can't predict the future. I'm not a psychic. But yeah. But anyway, we're going to continue what they said. So yeah.
Yeah.
And then that was supposed to be sufficient in terms of testing astrology, even though just collecting astrologers from a random astrology group is not necessarily going to net like the highest or most skilled or even proficient practitioners from the field.
Oh yeah, that one in particular, I think it was in Ohio or something, Indiana or something like that. But this guy from a college goes out and he finds some nice people that have an astrology club, which I had never heard of. Gives them a psychological test, probably similar to the one that was in Nature, the Sean Carlson one. And then, takes the results and shows that nothing happened. It's evidence that astrology doesn't work. And then that gets published in a psychological journal, and people, refer to it, and it gets around, and it's ridiculous. A lot of that has happened. There are some very bad, horrible studies of astrology that have gotten published in decent journals, because there's no, they call them peer-reviewed, but nobody's really qualified to do, to peer review an astrology article in those magazines. Probably not.
Right, because most scientists that would be on a peer-reviewed board of a scientific magazine not only wouldn't have any background in astrology or sufficient background, but they'd also have like an ideological sort of bias against it, which is one of the other issues that's a common recurring and major thing, and something I was reflecting on recently, because I feel like in my experience that the skeptical community was much more vibrant and much more, maybe vibrant isn't the right term, but bigger, like in the mid 2000s when I was first in the field for like the first decade. And I feel like that's declined over the course of the past decade. But in the period of time we're talking about was probably the time when the skeptical community was perhaps the most like organized and motivated, and I don't know if militant is the right term, but there was just a lot more going on.
I think it might be.
Yeah, in the 1970s and 80s, and just in terms of what that was like operating as an astrologer during that time. But not just that, but that with people like that there tends to be an ideological motivation or implicit assumption that astrology can't work, and therefore just cosmologically or philosophically, or there's a preconception that it's not possible that this works. So therefore, any attempts to try to validate it need to be stopped and need to be dismissed in some way, even when sometimes that runs counter to even like sort of realistic or acceptable like scientific practices. And that was the big issue with the Goklan studies and the different attempts to replicate the Mars effect.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that if you're, in science and you've gone through all the education and you basically have settled on a reductionist, physicist kind of perspective, astrology makes no sense in that context, none whatsoever. And if you accept astrology, it means you got to throw overboard everything that you've learned, or at least a lot of it. And I have had people in physics and some in philosophy that I have friends in those fields, and that's what they've told me. They've said that, if I buy astrology, then I got a real problem. Because that's going to interfere with everything that I've come to, conclude is true and real.
Because there's no known mechanism about how astrology would work.
Yeah, and also the implications of it, for a person, for example. I mean, the astrology of the person is the real touchy area. Nobody cares about the astrology of the weather or the climate, or at least not as much. But
yeah, I mean, I just have it's hard, a little bit understanding, because it's, oftentimes that presumption, that strong presumption, it's based on whatever limited understanding the person has about what astrology is to begin with, because it usually doesn't extend to even knowing about or being familiar with like birth charts, or that astrology is more than just sun sign astrology or something like that. So there's this perception or sort of prejudice against it intellectually before you even get to the point of like that there's more to it than just what the person is familiar with or what a person from the general public would be familiar with.
Yeah, they have a knee-jerk reaction. Lynn Margulis, who I worked for, and she's the one that was my advisor for my PhD program. She, the only thing she knew about astrology was that there were a lot of Scorpios in her family, like way more than there should have been. But she never really, she was so busy with her own things. She never had time to learn anything about it. But she and I were very good friends, and she used to test out astrology on some of her, peers in science. And she would mention that, she has a graduate student that's studying astrology, and she would say that, one guy almost had a heart attack. That she described him as just going, off the deep end, like he almost started shouting at her. And that almost everybody, said, well, that's a lot of, crap, come on, what's the matter with this, But there were a couple of them that popped up out of the woodwork that had been studying astrology on their own, and they just weren't going to open their mouth about it. And I was at a conference, a science conference in Italy one time, and one of the guys there came to me after, at a break and said, I heard from Lynn that, you study astrology. I don't tell anybody that, but I do as well, and I have some of my own ideas. Do you want to hear them? So he had the guy was a paleontologist, but he had this whole little thing on the side that he was doing with astrology, and it was interesting. It was kind of his own flavor of it. He got a lot of ideas from mainstream, astrology, but started developing, and I can't recall offhand exactly what some of those were, but that was fascinating to me, that there was, at least two people that I ran into in the sciences that kept their mouths shut and were exploring astrology on their own, but most of them had knee-jerk reactions, don't even bring it up.
Yeah, that's got to be one of the most interesting things from a social standpoint, is that because astrology in intellectual circles is viewed as, like Tarnas usually says, the gold standard of pseudoscience, or like the paradigm of what a pseudoscience is supposed to be about, that there are a number of people, there's a surprising amount of people that will not be open about their either interest in or practice of astrology to people around them or people in their social circles or especially their work circles, due to a fear of major repercussions, negative repercussions, if they were to like divulge that to people openly, that they could suffer, career setbacks or issues with religious family members or just a number of different things like that.
Oh yeah, I know quite a few people who are in business, work for corporations or teach at universities that I talk to. They ask me questions about astrology, or I in the past give a presentation somewhere and they come up to me afterwards and they just say, yeah, I do it. I bought a copy of Solar Fire and I'm exploring it and try out all these different things, and but I don't tell anybody that I work with about it.
Right. I mean, I think every practicing astrologer knows that and has that experience, because as soon as you start being a consulting astrologer on a long enough timeline, you see people from all walks of life and many different professions and many different stratas of society and everything else who have an interest in astrology, and you realize that they're not always, can't always be open about that in public.
Yeah. Well, I've had that problem too. I've early on, I mean, when I really got seriously involved in astrology, I was in my early 20s, I guess. And even people in my family had a little bit of a problem with it. That came up for a while. And my uncle, who was Sagittarius with Gemini moon, could handle any position, defended me. He says, hey, leave him alone. He's, he's not stupid. He's learning about something. What do you guys know about it? And I thought that was great. He was a good uncle. But there were other times where I was in group situations where people would start attacking astrology, and I got good enough to be able to stop it, put them down, and that was a bad thing. I mean, I got in trouble a few times for that. Like I was being some kind of meanie, putting somebody else down that was trying to put me down. Because in the larger scheme of things, astrology couldn't possibly be real. It was just some kind of like hobby that Bruce was having, was involved with. So I had to deal with it a lot and early on. And then after that, I just didn't care. I didn't care what people thought. And if somebody didn't like astrology, the hell with them.
Yeah, I mean, so that's, on the one hand, you get the increasing, the scientific sort of orthodoxy being against astrology, and that becoming increasingly militant through the rise of scientific skepticism in the 70s and 80s. And then on the other side of society and culture, you also still have centuries of pushback from religious sectors of society and the religious objections to astrology. So it's within this context that like some of the attempts to even try to validate astrology scientifically are happening in the 20th century. And the primary one, or the one that was the most promising, was the Goklan studies. And that's something that you spend time talking about at a few different points during the course of the book, and that it seems like you still think is relevant and needs to be part of the discussion today.
Oh yeah, I think that it was the most sustained, complex, and sophisticated astrological study so far, because he spent his whole life, and his wife was working with him, Michel and Francois Gauquelin, and it was rigorous. I mean, that study holds up to any great scientific study. I mean, there's a lot of garbage out there that's done, and that allows the FDA to make a drug legal. But Gauquelin's is just as tough and tight, and more so than most of these. And it's been challenged. If you interviewed Ken Irving, you know all about it. I mean, he's the one who's, the Tenacious Mars Effect, right, is the name of the book, right?
Yeah.
Earl and Irving.
I guess I'm bringing it up because there was a lot of excitement surrounding Gauquelin's work and other attempts to do studies, like scientific studies of astrology like that, where you kind of pick out one factor or a couple of factors in astrology and you try to test it scientifically. But I feel like the astrological community hit a wall in the 1980s and 1990s with some of those studies where for different reasons, things were not going as well as had been hoped. Sometimes, occasionally through like underhanded means, like some of the replications of the Goklan studies that were withheld or swept under the rug initially. And it seemed like, especially starting in the 90s, there started being a lot of reflections in the community about why this was, attempts to explain it, and a sort of decline in enthusiasm, and questions especially about whether that was even an appropriate way to attempt to validate astrology, so that you get the works of people like, most notably Jeffrey Cornelius and his work, The Moment of Astrology, that tries to explain why scientific tests of that sort, statistical tests primarily, might always be doomed to failure, or might not be an appropriate way to attempt to study the phenomenon of astrology. But it seems like in your book, that's something where you don't agree with that viewpoint and the way things have gone over the past 3 decades, and that you try to push back on that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him in the sense that reductionism in testing astrology, is, at least initially, it's not going to get good results. So it's going to look bad for astrology, because in astrology, you're testing a self-organizing system, and self-organizing systems, or emergent systems resist quantification. They're very hard to test. So, we're working with a difficult beast here. But I think there are some openings, and it depends on refinement. Like, for example, there was the NCGR suicide study. And so they got a lot of charts of suicides, people that committed suicide, and they tried to see what was common with them, and they tried everything. They threw the kitchen sink at it, Uranian astrology, everything, and they didn't really come up with anything that was statistically significant. Now, my take on that was that, there's different suicides for different reasons. And sure enough, when I was working on this book, I came across this paper that somebody wrote on a study of suicide ideation, like the correlation between suicide and what is generating the suicide showed some statistical significance with, one set of reasons rather than another. So, to me, I don't remember the details offhand right now, but, to me, that's like a lot of sciences. You have to start refining your sample set. Goklan got results because he didn't take all athletes. He took athletes that were good. And then he had to find some way of saying how they were good. So they had to have, scored in major competitions or be listed in books or whatever. And that was, checked by Ertl and a number of others, and it works. So that's called extreme sampling. And so you do have to do that. There are people that are doing it.
Yeah, so the point was that the phenomenon showed up in the charts of eminent athletes, not just any old athlete. But then there became a argument around what constitutes eminence and whether there's some subjective issues in terms of, deciding who's eminent versus who's not.
Yeah. But that happens in doing any kind of social science. I don't think it's, astrology's subject matter is complex, but so is psychology's, because it's almost the same. And, psychology has all the institutions, and it's aligned itself with the medical field, so it's got that advantage. And so, they keep working on these personality inventories, and, mostly they're self-created. The studies there are questionable. They have as hard a time of testing their subject as astrology does, but they're not astrology. Astrology is scary to people, because it interferes with fate and free will, and because the physicists don't like it. There's a lot of prejudice towards it. So astrologers, they have to do 10 times as much work to get any kind of attention. Meanwhile, Goklan study stands there. It's like a giant edifice in the field of astrology. It's a big building, and they don't want to look at it. Still goes on. There's still arguments pro and con, but I think it's pretty solid.
Right. I think I wrote down a sentence that you wrote at one point later in the book where you said, "It should be obvious by now that astrology does not lend itself to reductionism because it does not study easily reducible phenomenon."
Yeah.
So
yeah,
part-
self-organizing systems are they're in motion. It's hard to